1.5. And there it goes. All right. Good evening and welcome to Winterviews Series 3, Episode 6. I am your host, Catherine Silva, Cat for short, and this evening we have LC Marino, otherwise known as Lucas. Lucas, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Cat. Thanks for allowing me to hang out with you tonight. I've been looking forward to this since the fall when you told me that this show existed and all the things you were doing. And I was like, this sounds so cool. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm very excited that we are finally having this discussion because, I teased a pretty silly question that we were going to have discussion about end of like taking over the world, I think was the silly discussion, which has nothing to do with our topic this evening, but still we'll have time for that later on.
Awesome.
Do you want to give our viewers just a sort of brief rundown on who you are and what you write?
Sure. So as Kat said, I write nonfiction and I write fiction. You're probably more interested in my fiction, which is mostly grief and psychological horror. I'm currently in the middle of authoring a series called The Haunting of the Whispering House, and that has 2 titles in it. One is Bury the Child, which is a novella, and the second is the first novel in the series, which just came out March 1st, which is titled Burn the Girls. And I'm just reveling in the post-launch fuzz that your brain is after you put a book into the world. So I've been working on a couple of other novel projects in the interim the last month, but that's basically what I do these days. I also am an entrepreneur, own a small training company here in Virginia, and I got into that after almost 22 years in the Coast Guard. So I started writing when I was younger. I had to stop for a while to do the military career thing. And then as soon as I retired and had the opportunity to come back to it, I ran screaming and shouting into this wild world that is indie publishing.
I had forgotten about the Coast Guard. I knew it was something. I just couldn't remember exactly what it was. Yeah.
Engineer by trade. So it's fun. Most people don't think that someone that has an engineering background that would also be involved in art.
It's
seems
cool,
to be at
though.
odds. Yeah.
No, it's cool having the science sort of the technical sciencey background and then also translating it into on the creative side. There's a number of people who do that. So it's unique anyway. It's how you do it is unique. Yeah. Sorry, I did not mean to cut you off there.
No, I was getting ready to say Alex Ebenstein. I think he works in geology. I was interviewing him for the podcast and I was like, what do you do? And he makes maps. And I was like,
that's so cool.
That's like a really technical field. I'm like, that's awesome. So
yeah, I didn't actually know that Alex did that. That's pretty neat. Huh.
Yeah. Yep.
So many hidden talents.
Just a bunch of nerds. Making books, being nerds. So yeah.
So today our discussion surrounds psychological horror. We'll undoubtedly talk about grief horror as well, because that seems to be an ongoing theme this season, because all of our guests have written grief horror in one way or another. So just get used to it, people. It's going to happen.
It's unavoidable.
Yeah. So, but anyway, in psychological horror, could you give our audience an idea of what that entails? It is a really popular subgenre, but still there may be 1 or 2 people who are not as familiar.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because there's all these different dimensions to the application of psychological horror, but inevitably what ends up happening is, whether it's a thriller or it's a horror or whatever, you end up with a heavy focus on the very wild and broad application of heavily engaging the mind in the actual horror or the actual elements of horror in the story, rather than just being byproducts of it, meaning like you're not just trying to process external things that are
Yeah.
happening. A lot of what psychological horror is that a lot of the elements of the story that carry weight for plot are actually internal to the psychological trauma, handling, processing all of that
Hmm.
fun stuff that comes along with psychological horror. And that's one of the reasons why grief is so prominent in application, is because it's an emotion that we take a lot of time to process. So
Hmm. Yep.
yeah. Also, I think it's kind of terrifying. It fits so well, to think of all the things that could go both wrong internally with the mind, and also how poorly we can process the external when our mind isn't able to handle that well. So it
Mm.
all kind of, depending on how you write your story, whether you're writing it close to the main character through POV or not, depends on like how you can angle that, which I've seen some fascinating applications of that recently with like the September House, for example. I don't know if you've read that yet.
I haven't read that one yet.
Clarissa Orlando. Great audiobook, by the way. I'm a big fan of audiobooks. I read everything, paper, ebook, whatever. But her audiobook of that is fantastic because it's a
Mhm.
very close narrated first person. So you feel
Okay.
like you're just being told this amazing story the whole time.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I will have to make a note of that one to put on my never ending TBR. Um, I really should have a like grief horror TBR and then a everything else TBR, because I feel like the grief horror stuff is starting to stack up a little
Yeah.
against the other stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
I have a
but yeah, sorry.
I,
Again.
I have a third tier in my TBR, and it's the Brian Bowyer tier. It's just exclusive to
Oh
itself.
yeah.
When I really want to step outside of my norm and just read something that drives me right back into my norm, I go pick up one of Brian's books and I'm going, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. I gotta
Yeah.
go back.
There's it's very much like having a conversation with Brian.
It
His
is.
books are very much like having a conversation with him, in just this like you are utterly fascinated by
Yeah.
everything. Um so if anybody that's watching is not familiar with Brian Bowyer's stuff, like, you should check it out. It is entertaining, and you've not read anything like it, I am sure.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so getting into our topic, I'm going to refer to my list. So I'm going to read off my list because,
Fancy list.
um, yeah, my giant list. Um, what is it about psychological horror that really excites you and makes you want to write it?
Um, it's, um, and this might just be the logical side of my engineering brain or whatever, but it seems so real, and the
Mm,
potential seems so high for it to actually occur. And it's so relatable that I think it relates, it translates into like very easily into tangible fear for the reader. And I
mhm.
find it exciting to write because of that. When I think about what terrifies me, almost all of it involves in some way, shape, or form a pretty deep dive into the psychological aspects of fear and
Yeah.
motivators for fear and responses to fear stimulus. So some of it's emotional, some of it is just trying to process something so unexpected and unbelievable in the moment
Mhm.
that you're you're flipping the whole time, and there's not much you can do to grab. You can't grab it with your hands. You can't
No.
call someone else to help you. Like in the moment, you're completely alone inside here to try and manage whatever is happening. And it could be coming in here, it could be coming in here, it could just be thoughts, whatever. That's what kind of fascinates me about psychological horror, also it lends itself really well to processing any type of external horror that obviously would have a significant impact on the main character's psyche. So you can
Mhm.
use psychological horror in all different types of settings in horror, and it still be very relevant and relatable to the reader. So
Yeah, it's I agree. I actually, my next question was related to that, and that is, do you find that it's easier or harder when you're mixing uh, like supernatural elements with your psychological horror, that it kind of takes away from the believability of things?
sure. Yeah, that is obviously or not obviously, that is honestly a very tight rope for me to walk on when I'm writing, because I want the supernatural or the paranormal in some cases to be almost confusing to the main character so that
Mhm.
it's contributing to their psychological distress rather than causing them immediate disbelief. I want it to be either they want it to be real, so they're trying to accept it, which
Mhm.
is
Yep.
heavy on the grief horror elements,
Yep.
or it's so unbelievable to what to their normal experience that they are breaking in a way inside, and they're trying
Mhm.
to process something that they just can't chew on. And so I feel like if you can implement like these supernatural or paranormal events in a way that it amplifies the psychological horror, but also gives you an opportunity as the writer and the reader to kind of dive into the mind's processing of these seemingly unbelievable things.
Yep.
There's immediate conflict in that, and the choices that you can then impose on your characters are really interesting, right?
Mhm.
So when you think about the dynamics of like building out a character and their relation to plot, you can use those types of stimulus in the story to create this kind of naturally suspenseful choice for the main character that probably wouldn't occur without that amplified sense of stimulation that comes with something either so unbelievable or on the verge of unbelievable that your mind just cannot process it properly. So I use it as a tool.
Yeah.
In other words, like torment my main characters with a little bit of the supernatural if I can.
And it was believable, certainly. I actually finished reading um, Bury the Child today. I have not left my review yet, but I will. It will be incoming soon.
Oh, thank you.
Um, and my next question is about Bury the Child, which deals with the psychology of grief in horror and how it plays tricks on the mind. Can you give us some background into how you approached writing that for this book?
Yes. So, interestingly enough, that book was a revelation that occurred to me while I was plotting these three novels in this trilogy. And I got to the point where I said, okay, I think I've got this plot at a very high strategic level mapped out for these three books. And they all look like they can stand on their own and they've got great strength. And then I had this moment of realization that I'd never addressed why any of this was happening
Hmm.
in this house. And I said, well, what would have caused this? And the last thing I wanted to do, not that there's anything wrong with doing this, but the last thing I wanted to do for this particular series was make it something um, traditionally causing these types of hauntings, or I didn't want to use something that was almost like felt just too obvious. I wanted to
Okay.
create a situation where you wanted to both root for and root against this main character throughout the trilogy, and I almost wanted to make it heartbreaking for the reader. Like you wanted this person to succeed, but you also know they cannot. And so Lydia was born, the main character, the mother in this
Mhm.
story was born of this idea that I wanted someone relatable to haunt the house, and I wanted you to get to know them a little bit before it happens. And I
Mhm.
also wanted you to just just at the deepest part of your body, like deep down inside, I wanted you to feel like so sorry for her that you couldn't possibly be angry at her for doing what she's doing. Like you had
Yeah.
to sympathize with this cause. But
Yeah.
that's kind of where it started. And unfortunately, it also led me to the question, so, well, what could motivate someone to be in a situation like Lydia is in? And it would have to be the absolute worst loss. And that was the loss of a child in her case. So
Hmm.
that's what drove me right into this deep dive in grief, because it originally just started out as this really cool kind of gothic depiction of a haunted house. And then it quickly turned heavy grief horror.
Hmm.
And it was almost like Lydia was telling me that's what it needed to be. She's like, you're going to have to put me in a really bad spot, dude. And then we're going to have to go into this house together. So that's kind of where the motivation to delve into the psychological horror was. I wanted to present a grief so overwhelming that she would be put in a position where she had to question whether what she was experiencing was real or not.
Yep.
And her grief creates this filter with which she can't really determine that accurately until the pieces start to come together across the story.
Hmm. Yep. Okay. I have so many arrows here. I wrote questions out of order. When you're establishing your characters, not just in Bury the Child, but in any of your books, it's really important that the audience believes in the delusion or believes in the character's feelings. Do you have a particular way of getting into your characters' heads when you're doing that?
Yeah, I can only do it by immersion, which is I can plot. I'm a plantser. I can plot and pants, but I can't do either of them completely without a good dash of the other. So like I have to
Yep.
plot in order to know which direction I'm moving in. And I like the structure, and it makes me write faster, and it gives me the confidence to write more freely if I have enough plotted. However,
Mhm.
I have no idea what that character is going to say. And I don't necessarily restrict their movements or actions or choices or situations or anything. Once I get started, I let the story start to tell itself, and where it goes, it
Yep.
goes. So in that sense, what I try to do is write close enough to the main character that I cannot ignore the natural progression of her story. And her
Yep.
natural progression is going to happen through thoughts and words. So that's where writing psychological and grief horror kind of intersecting, it really helps, because you're spending a lot of time in the mind of the main character. And so that internal dialogue is readily occurring, and
Hmm.
they're trying to think their way through the problems that they're experiencing, and they're trying to think their way through the life they're living. And that process of moving one sentence or conversation at a time with the main
Yep.
character, internally and externally, helps me walk in their footsteps. And I try to put in my mind an identity where the main character isn't too far away from who I probably am, so
Yep.
that it's a little bit more realistic. It also, to me, is a little jarring. Some people make a living writing like this, so I'm not downplaying or poo-pooing it or whatever, but I can't write a main character, at least not yet, that's too difficult for me to agree with as a reader.
Hmm.
so,
Sure.
so
Yeah.
naturally, I think I'm inclined to write someone that I'm a little bit more invested in emotionally. And that's what
Yeah.
happened with Lydia. I wanted to feel heartbroken for Lydia before I even started telling her story. So I dive into her motivations, like why is she hurting? And when you experience that hurt, what would that possibly feel like? And what do the normal things in life start to look like and sound like and feel like when you're living the world in that state? And what kind of conversations are you going to have with your loved ones and your best friends? And
Yep.
all the things start to come together when you start to try and empathize with the main character. And I think if you can do a good job of doing that as an author, then it makes it easier for the reader to empathize because you're kind of guiding them through that empathy as you tell the story.
Yeah. That's, I was about to say, empathy is definitely the easiest way to identify with a character, especially in grief horror. It's so much harder to get on the same page as a character that's just like mostly all bad. um, and so,
Yeah.
and then of course, naturally, you're telling grief horror, so you want to be able to feel something with them.
Right. Yeah.
So totally makes sense to me, and I like it. I am also a plantser, so
Yeah.
um,
Long
do you
live the
ever
planters.
do you ever hear the voice? Does it have a sound to you?
Yes. But it's kind of weird because when you think about something someone has said to you and you hear it in kind of like a kind of like a morphing of your voice and their voice together, or a watered
Mm,
down version of their voice in your head. I kind of experience that with these characters. Like when I'm actually writing, I can hear them speaking as if they're standing in front of me, like
yeah,
especially when they're talking to other characters out loud. But when I'm plotting or thinking through the chapter I'm getting ready to write, or if I stop to
yeah,
consider an element, they feel like a memory. It's almost like I'm not like, okay, Lydia, like show me where you want to go next. I'm not having that kind of experience, although that would probably be a really good thing for me to do. I'm usually like, okay, what was happening here, and what are the areas, the opportunities I'm missing, and then
hmm,
usually I try to replay some of what's happened, and I can hear the conversations again, but it's like a memory. It's
yeah,
almost like a figment of my imagination, which it
gotcha.
clearly is, although good luck convincing me of that sometimes. Yeah.
Need to start having conversations with them.
Yeah. Actually, it's kind of funny you bring that up because I was talking to someone about Lydia when I was writing that story. I think it might have been my wife. And um, they were giving me this weird look like, this isn't a real person. Like, it's not, you're not actually hanging out talking with this person, just to remind you, like, this is make believe, dude.
It's it's so funny because it's hard. Like, I love having discussions about getting into characters' heads with other writers, but there are some times that I forget that other people don't know what that experience is like
Mm,
to have characters channeled through your brain. And people are just totally like, yeah, you're writing all this horror and there's voices in your head, um and it's like, it's not exactly that, but still, it's, it's a sobering thought anyway to
right.
remember.
Well, I can
Yeah.
see the things too. And I know some writers are like, they don't have that, or they do have that.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I'm it's like a movie playing in my head while I'm writing.
Yeah.
I kind of like am not visually in the moment when I'm writing. Like I'm looking
Yeah.
at the words and I'm typing and everything, but I'm so involved in trying to see what's happening in my head that I'm kind of like recessed. I'm kind of like telling a tale that I'm watching, almost like a
Yep.
movie playing out in my head, and I'm just describing what I'm seeing in my head. And
Yeah.
that's kind of, I guess that's why the voices and everything kind of come along with that visual depiction in my mind when I'm writing. It's all kind of like a movie just running, you know.
Yeah.
So
Same. I get that. um it's a really interesting, it's like a stream of consciousness thing. um but it's, I don't know if I could write any other way. So it's
well,
really cool that you do
it,
that too.
it's funny you say that because if I'm not experiencing that, I don't think I'm writing the right thing. I'll stop. I'm
Yeah.
like, hi, something's wrong. I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
not seeing it, like I need to be.
Yeah.
And then
You're
there's
not
times,
into it.
Yeah, and then there's times when you have that moment where you see something very clearly and you're in it and you're writing it. It's awesome. And then your editor sends it back and goes, this whole chapter's got to go. And you're like, but it was
Oh,
so good. It was so
yeah.
good when I was writing it.
You
Like I had
didn't
a
see
moment.
it like I saw it.
Yeah, I had an experience with that chapter and you're like, nah, dude, it's got to go. It's not,
Yeah.
this is actually my editor told me something. There's a chapter that was removed from Bury the Child. And I ripped the parts of it out and reused them in other areas of the story because I didn't want to lose these key elements of this chapter. But it was the second chapter in the book. And Zach Bohannon, who's my very good friend, he's my buddy, he's my book coach, my editor, my co-author and buddy, everything. Zach's great. He goes, dude, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but this chapter's gone. You got to scrap it. And I said, well, what was wrong with it? Because I had such a great experience with it. And he's like, you wrote this for yourself. You didn't write it for the reader. And he could tell when he read it. And I was like, yeah, you're probably right. If you hadn't have said it just like that, I probably would have been ready to put up a little bit of an argument, but he was right. He's like, you had this great experience with it, but dude, as a reader, I didn't get that.
Yeah. That's cool if he can tell you that. And
yeah.
My next question is about the follow-up to Bury the Child. The Bury the Child is a prequel for Burn the Girls, which I have not had the pleasure of reading yet, but soon. How is your approach different to writing this one than the first one?
So I tried to capitalize on momentum, which anyone who's ever done this before probably stubbed their toe like I did. I was so excited by the end of Bury the Child. Like I loved the way the book wrapped. I felt so good about the story. I felt like I was like a writing machine at the last act of that book, which was a short book. It's only, just under 20,000 words. It just barely qualifies as a novella. And I'm like, dude, I've got my wind. I'm just going to keep rolling. I'm going to jump right into Burn the Girls. And I realized that story was going to be a much bigger meal. It's 3-4 times the story. The pace, I couldn't possibly maintain that same pace of story for 65,000 words and do it the right way. So I kind of stepped back a little bit. I wrote the first couple of chapters and I stepped back and I said, okay, is this the right way to do this? Am I happy with what's going on? Yes, yes, yes. But all of a sudden I realized I've got this expectation of myself to make sure that this story outshines Bury the Child. Like as happy as I am about Bury the Child, I want this first novel in the series to be better. I don't want it to be, I don't want a sophomore slump. It's like, I don't want the second book to be like a continuation thereof or a step back from the prequel novella. So I very intentionally just kind of hit the brakes for a second, step back and did a little bit more work on the plot, the structure, and pulled some deeper things through, because one of the liberties I had with Bury the Child was I didn't have to manage as much theme because it was a novella. But the moment I moved into like novel territory, I'm like, okay, there's going to be a lot more decisions made. There's going to have to be more conviction in less brutal things than just, than the one main thing I could carry through and Bury the Child. So it kind of put this onus on me to be a little bit more creative and to think about my story a little bit more before I committed to writing it the way I had it plotted. And thank God I did that, because it completely changed the story. It completely changed the plot. And all of a sudden Constance emerged, the main character for Burn the Girls. And I'm like, now this is the way it's supposed to be. I didn't realize I didn't have the right main character. Like I needed to step back for a minute and say, what do I really want this story to be? And look at it from a big picture. And once I did that and I got it all nailed down, I was like, there she is. There's Constance. This is my 18-year-old, strong-willed, wants to go out and take over the world. She's just got this fire in her belly, but she's going to be very conflicted and things are going to happen that she didn't plan. So, yeah.
That's what it's all about.
I
putting
needed
them
that
through the
fire.
ringer.
Yeah.
I had a question about your setting. Why did you choose the 60s?
Yes, that is the second time I've had that question in the last week, and I'm happy to answer it every time because it was a reverse engineering thing. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'd kind of plotted out this trilogy, and I wanted to make sure that everything timed out logically. I
Okay.
didn't want the stories to run one right into the other. I wanted some space between the stories for certain reasons. I wanted it to be a new feeling environment because a certain amount of time has passed. It's a new decade. It's a new world that we're living in,
Mhm.
essentially from every 10 to 20 years. So I thought, well, that would be a really great way to keep the series feeling fresh. So when do I want this last bit of the story to happen? How close to today does it need to occur? And I thought about writing the last book in the 90s. I wanted it to be
Okay.
kind of relevant to the time period of my teenage years, which, yeah, I graduated high school in 1997. So, I was an 80s kid and a 90s teen. And that changed as I plotted further. I said, oh man, you know
Mhm.
what? This last book's actually going to happen closer to now. So I gave myself
Gotcha.
some more room, and
Okay.
I wanted it to carry over at least two generations of the family. So when I reverse engineered it with the most liberty to give myself, I ended up dead smack in the 1960s. And I thought,
Okay.
am I really going to write a story about the 1960s in Southeastern Virginia? I wasn't here.
Yeah.
so, so that's kind of how I got to the point where it was either going to be the 60s or the 70s. And I thought,
Mhm.
there's just this weird twist to the 60s. As odd as the 70s were, especially the latter half of the 70s, the 60s, there was still this like hangover from the 50s magic.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite Vietnam full swing yet. Like the country was in this interesting spot. And I thought, maybe this is like a Tim Burton influence too, like but I just thought of all the fashion and the music and just how
Mhm.
surreal a time the 60s were. And I thought, you know what, that'll be fun. Let's try it.
Nice.
So there you go.
Awesome. Well, it's the second book that I've read recently that was
Mm.
a dated grief horror story. The last one was Chad Lutzky's, which was in the 70s. So nice to have the two paired there.
Yeah.
Um, and sorry, I'm lost again because, again, there's so many arrows.
All the arrows.
Um,
Is it
all
like
the arrows.
like one of those maps with the lines all over it?
It's not quite that crazy, but it's close. Um, I totally off topic, but I'm curious. Do you
Mhm.
ever write to music?
All the time. Cannot write without it.
Okay.
Yep. That is kind of my jam. Ha, get it? Yes.
Do you, when you were working on these books, did you have a particular band that you listened to, or do you have like a playlist?
Yeah. So I always select the music the minute I sit to write. So in the moment of writing, I kind of think about like what's going to move me where I want to go right now.
Hmm.
And some days it's Tori Amos,
Nice.
and some
Yeah.
days it's Deftones.
Okay.
And the predominant themes that kept pulling me, well, the music, I'm looking for a response from the music that matches the emotion that I have to write in.
Yep.
So I'm
Yep.
looking to feel that crushing weight. I need the music to take me there. That puts me in a good spot to be empathetic to the emotion of the character, and then I can write. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, so there was a good bit of Tori Amos, especially in the first half of that book.
Nice.
Um, Yeah, and then Leprous was really prominent. They have a song
Hmm.
called "The Sky Is Red,"
Okay.
and I swear I looped that song the entire time I was writing the last 3 chapters of Bury the Child. It was just like constantly going. There were like 2 or 3 songs from Leprous that just were on a loop, to kind of keep me right in that sweet spot where the pace of the music kind of keeps me moving at the right pace, and
Yep.
the emotion that the music's pulling from you is there as well. There was some uh Periphery as well,
Okay.
which is a little bit more energy, obviously, but that was kind of the Bury the Child background. There's like the top 3 or 4. With Burn the Girls, it morphed a bit, and I was really
Okay.
listening to a lot of like there's a solo viola player. Her name is Kristen Line.
Hmm.
Just beautiful, but
Hmm.
just perfect for what I was trying to write. And I actually reached out to her and said on Instagram, was like, "Hey, I'm writing a lot to your music, and I thought I just wanted to say thank you." And
That's so cool.
we connected and hit it off. And so like we're still in touch and everything. It's really cool. So,
Nice.
yeah. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yep.
Yeah. I write with music all the time, so I'm always curious to know. Some people can write with songs with lyrics, some people can't do it. Um, some people it depends on the story, so it's always fun to gauge where people are at with that.
Yeah.
Um, do you do you have playlists up anywhere for those?
You
Or
know,
are they
I probably should
secret?
post them somewhere digital, like on my website or something, but I did put a list in the back of Burn the Girls.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah. I
Awesome.
actually put a whole dedicated section at like at the very end of the book after the acknowledgments. Um I put a whole music playlist, and some of it's art, just general artist recommendations, like, hey, everything this person's doing, no matter what song comes on, I'm in it, I'm there.
Nice.
And I mean, there was everything from Depeche Mode to,
Yes.
I mean, I was just all in on, I mean, Burn the Girls was such a great writing experience. Like I could just package all that up and keep it forever. I would. Um, yeah, there's almost 2 pages of
Oh wow.
like, of a list of different artists and songs that were just prominently played. Veil of Maya. Um, and I've been listening to a lot of Wheel,
Mm,
a lot of like progressive metal.
okay.
Uh, Tesseract right now is just everything. The band
Hmm.
Tesseract, their latest album. Um, I mean, just that their last 2 albums, you could put them on back to back. I could write on that for years. So,
I'm
yep,
not familiar with them, so I'll have to check them out.
amazing band from the UK.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
yep.
Um, I was going to ask you what some of your favorite examples of psychological horror are. Maybe some that have inspired you or some that have just resonated with you. And this goes across all forms of media.
So this one is a question I was anticipating, and I was like, this is going to be the hardest question to answer because there's so it's such a I don't want to say it's a blurry line of like trying to classify psychological horror. Like you could name books where people are like, oh, that was a very traumatic experience for the main
Yeah.
character. So does that classify or not? I think that in my opinion, um, there's so much grief in Pet Cemetery that you can't
Mm,
not, the whole book is about these psychological dilemmas that the father has with losing his son. And for anyone who
yep.
hasn't read Pet Cemetery, I don't know that I can say, I don't want to spoil it. It's like, it's been out like 40 years now,
Yeah. People have
35
had
years.
their chance.
Yeah. But you got to read it because the story is just about this constant conflict, and then the decision to succumb to the temptations. and
Hmm.
then the psychological and physical repercussions of those poor decisions. But I would say, as far as Stephen King is concerned, obviously The Shining is
Hmm.
a dramatic example of a book that is almost predominantly, in my eyes, a psychological horror.
Hmm.
I was infatuated with Edgar Allan Poe growing up, and I
Hmm.
feel like it's easier to relate to this psychological layer of poetry than sometimes it
Hmm.
is for a novel. So
Sure.
for me, any poetry that Poe put forth was, to me, an anchor of psychological suspense, horror. I mean, you name it. I mean, A Telltale Heart to me was like a
Yeah.
total psych horror story. And some people would hear me say that and go, ah,
Well,
no, dude.
it is, though. It
It is.
totally is.
Yeah, he's tormented the whole time
Yeah.
by the sounds of the heart. And you're going,
Yeah.
can you really hear a heart, or is it all in his head? And then, are they going to know what I'm here? Like, can they see? Are the police reading my face? Like, so anyways, I go back to kind of the traditional roots of Stephen King and even Alfred Hitchcock, like The Rear Window.
Yeah.
Oh, love it. Like, I guess you could, I mean, I pulled some of, to me, like stories like The Exorcist, and they didn't have as much of that psychological bend to it, but
Yeah.
Carrie, oh my gosh. Carrie is like, it's all her emotions. That whole story is
Yeah.
about empathizing with Carrie's distraught, tormented existence. So yeah, I'm obviously leaning a lot on earlier King in that answer, but to me, those are kind of like some of the more prominent influences on me when I was growing up, because that's what I was
Gotcha.
reading.
Yeah.
So,
Sure. Um, so I do want to open it up because I feel like we talked about it a little bit in the last episode, that it doesn't necessarily have to be inspiration from horror that gave you ideas for writing your book. Aquino pulled a lot of things from different genres when he was working on Deep, and I also pull a lot of things from different genres. So it could be just, some psychological, not horror, or some movie that's not even
sure.
portrayed as a psychological movie that really like influenced you.
Oh yeah,
Um,
like Silence of the Lambs. I
yeah,
mean, some of the crime mystery thrillers, I mean, just so deeply rooted in it. I was obsessed with true crime stories growing up.
mhm,
The Stranger Beside Me from Anne Rule, which is a real life account of being close to and knowing Ted Bundy.
yeah,
And I mean, talk about a mind twist. Like, she realizes she knows this guy and she's
yeah,
a journalist and writes this amazing story about Ted Bundy and the whole time of all that going on. And it's like, to me, that kind of stuff was fascinating because it made me question the borders between sanity and insanity, what would drive someone to behave these ways. I was very much attracted to and
hmm,
interested in the macabre, and the psychology to me was just this fascinating thing. My mom was a psych nurse at first, and she
oh,
worked,
gotcha,
yeah, she worked in a ward with psychologically, like, um, criminally insane people.
hmm,
And she would come home with these stories. She's like, Luke, you won't
yeah,
believe what happened today. And I'm like,
jeez,
but she also could come home and tell me what had happened to these people that caused them to end up where they were. And they were these
yeah,
just traumatic life events that took people that probably would have had a perfectly normal life and, you know, turned them in a different way very young. And I
wow,
found all that very inspirational and fascinating and
hmm,
terrifying and all the things.
sure,
Yeah.
wow,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a very different feeling when it becomes real. It's like you know, creating that trauma for characters, creating that grief and that psychology
Hmm.
is can be fun, not in a psychotic way
Right.
for everybody watching. But then when it suddenly becomes real, when you are like, yeah, this actually happened, this person, you know, is now can't take care of themselves and they're in this facility. It's just like,
Yeah.
it's very, well, I'm going to use the word again, sobering.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. We also had a friend of the family who had suffered just unbearable loss. She lost, her children as adults, and it was one
mm,
after another. And it was very heartbreaking and helpless feeling to be close to somebody who just lived this tragic life.
yeah,
And none of these things were necessarily anything she could control or she did.
sure.
And, being close to that experience at the same time that I was writing these books really kind of, all that stuff just stays really relevant in your
Yeah.
mind, and I guess in many ways subconsciously inspires what's happening, so much so that she passed during the writing of Burn the Girls,
Oh,
and I
jeez.
dedicated a character to her. Nurse
Wow.
Nancy is this lady. And I even put in the acknowledgments that, or in the acknowledgments that part of this story was so heavily inspired by her um, that I wanted to make sure that I kind of captured that forever and
Yeah.
gave her due. So
Well, that's really awesome of you for doing that too. And I'm so sorry.
yeah, I mean, but like you said, this stuff is real. I mean, these things happen, and I'm sure you're familiar with the band Tool and their music, but they have some pretty deep songs, and they have a song titled Vicarious, and it's about how
Mhm.
people live vicariously through the lives of others, mostly the
Mhm.
negative or bad parts of other people's lives. That's why we're obsessed with watching news, and we're obsessed with
Yep.
watching these shows where all these terrible things happen, but they're happening to someone else. And I can
Yeah.
experience them a bit through that. We're living vicariously through these other people. And I've had to kind of resolve the fact that I couldn't walk away from these stories with guilt about living vicariously through these characters. Like,
Mhm.
I don't
Yeah.
want to experience a shred of the grief I have to write for them, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's I think there's catharsis in it. There's living vicariously and there's catharsis in it too, because
Mhm.
you're also hopefully I don't know because I haven't read Burn the Girls yet, but I hopefully there is there's some resolution to these characters uh terrible things that happen to them, or maybe not. But again, there's that catharsis uh in the idea that it's happening to a fictional character.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I have to fight the urge to just, I was joking with Zach, who is my editor,
Hmm.
that I'm going to get him a shirt for Christmas that, has a body count on it of all the people he's saved, because
Oh
he's
man.
he's always kept me from wiping all these people out in my stories. And because of that, there is some resolution in the stories, but I have to always fight this urge to leave it open. Like, maybe you don't always get what you feel like you should, but I've
Hmm.
got to stay true to writing a story that the
Yeah,
reader is going to enjoy, and not just like my twisted little.
sure. Yeah. That is hilarious though, and you totally should do that.
Yeah, he's getting a body
Be a
count t-shirt.
scoreboard.
Yeah, all the lives he's saved. So
So that does bring us to the last question that I have this evening, which is we've had a theme this season, which is called the aside question, which does not have anything to do with the topic at hand, although I have asked you several that don't have anything to do with the topic tonight. And the last question is the aforementioned world domination question, which I asked you about last year. And we were going to discuss our plans for how we would take over the world.
Yes.
I'm still working on my plan, but I'm pretty sure that it involves animals in some way. But I would like to hear what your world domination plot looks like.
So yours involves animals. I don't think you can have a world domination plot without animals, by the way. So I'm a big fan. There are partners in crime, whether we want to think about it that way or not. I think, by the way, your hold on a second. Your plan has to include a little bit more than just animals, because I've read.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Your expanding purgatory is.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I would say that's dominating the world for me to eventually rule it. That I don't think anybody wins.
What about
in
the temple?
That's the monolith.
Yes, the monolith. Which, by the way, when you use that term in that story about, and I mean, I don't think I encountered that until probably the halfway point of the book, maybe end of the first act. I had to go look up monolith.
That's okay.
It's like,
that's all right.
I know what this is, but I need to verify.
Yeah.
I was like, awesome. Cause I was very visually engaged in your story. So my plan would involve a heavy focus on, we have to reinstate the fact that everyone has to be involved in some form of arts. Like, it's mandatory. I was in the military for 2 decades, and something I used to hear all the time when I was in the service was they ought to have mandatory service. And most of the people in the service would say, nah, you don't want that. For several reasons. One, the motivations to do what you're doing are a little different when it's an all volunteer service. And just because it's mandated doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a positive contribution. So having people that actually want to do what they're doing is a pretty powerful thing to have. And for that reason, I think you could have people fall in love with the motives of your world takeover if their art was involved, because I feel like it's such a personal experience. So we need to mandate that. Also, it is mandatory in our plan for domination that music become a primary public motivator. However, we have to be careful about what we allow in the public space. I'm not saying we should censor or moderate, but I don't want to be inundated with 90s pop the whole time.
No. So, that's okay.
So I think everyone's going to have to write a story. Everyone's going to have to try and write a book at least once. Everyone's going to have to learn a music instrument. We all have to learn at least one other language other than our native tongue.
Yep.
And we all have to have lived both in a city and in the countryside. And then once you have all those things checked off, then we can vote.
Experience. I would add that they have to work in sales for a while, or in the restaurant industry.
Absolutely. 100% back that up. Yeah. I actually told my son, he was last summer, he's 17. So last year he was like, I think I want to get a job at this place in town. And I said, you're going to be working with the general population like all day. And right now he works isolated at a computer. And I thought, and I went, you know what? You should go do that.
Yeah.
Man, do you learn a lot in a very short period of time.
Yeah. It's like, for people who have not worked in sales or worked in the restaurant industry, it's a lot. You're there for 8 or 9 hours a day, and especially if you're not an extroverted person,
right,
you have to be. So you almost have to kind of find that switch and turn it on, turn it off. I'm speaking with 17 years of sales under my belt. So
You learn a lot about what qualifies a good human from a bad human by
Yes.
how people treat other people in those industries. And yeah, which by the way is like kind of, I guess, one of the final elements of my plan would be that we now have a rule where no one's allowed to buy their way to the top of any market or industry.
Yep.
Like politics, entertainment, anything. You can't buy your way to the top. It's not allowed. You have to, it's a merit-based system.
Yep.
If you want to get where you want to be, you gotta do the work to get there.
Yep.
And you can't buy your way into any of those places.
Does that include like the elimination of money then of currency?
I don't know that we could, because I think whatever you replace money with is going to just end up taking eventually, with enough time, that form of currency will take over.
What if it's good deeds though? It's not a physical form of
payment.
Payment.
That's a good thought. That could be a thing where you earn a certain amount of, well, what do they, so they have what, social currency is that in China they do that?
Oh gosh,
I think so. They have a thing called social currency. Anyone out there who's an expert at that, if you want to chime in and save me from my poor adaptations of that society, please do. But yeah, I could go with that. Some good deed currency.
Yep.
Yeah. Or maybe that's how you earn your money.
Yep.
If we keep money, you just, you earn it through good deeds, and bad deeds, you get taxed.
Yep. You get into the whole like, all right, and what does this kind of good deed cost then?
Yeah.
Because then you'll have all these little things that nobody's going to want to do because they're not making the big bucks doing money just flaws everything. It's just
it interferes with the thinking.
It does.
I was just teaching a class tonight to a group of graduate level entrepreneurs in engineering class, and we were talking about enlightened capitalism, and I was talking about how wonderful freedom is, but how difficult freedom is. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about a market or if you're talking about a society. There's a cost to having freedom. And a very smart person I worked with when I was in DC, when I was trying to wrap my head around what was happening in Congress, because we worked with Congress directly in my job, he was talking about how it's all scrum. It takes all this work to move the ball this way just a little bit, and it gets pushed back that way. And I think about that all the time when I think about like freedom. It's so difficult to have balanced freedom, and it's just a heck of an experiment. And here we are trying to do the same thing with capitalism, but you will tip one way for a while before you can get back the other way. And when you're tipping, and it feels like we've got a tip going on.
Yeah.
It hurts right now.
It does. Yeah.
It really does. Freedom's tough.
Well, I feel like we went to a dark place at the end of this. Very suddenly. We were talking about happy things, doing good deeds, and then all of a sudden just like right back down the hill.
Well, that's because we went from our plan for domination to reality.
To reality, yeah.
Motivations, though. They're motivations for our plan.
Yes. Well, like we'll just pretend that that we're heading back up the hill with our sled here towards the good things. And we're going to bring the evening to an end because that was my last question. So I want to thank you for coming on and sharing all of your psychological horror wisdom with our audience tonight.
Thank you for having me.
It was lots of fun, and hopefully we'll get to do this again sometime, and I'll see you very soon, in less than a month. We're both going to be at AuthorCon, so if anybody in the audience is in the Williamsburg, Virginia area, April 12th through 14th, you should come hang out. All the details are at the Scares That Care website, which is scaresthatcare.com.
That's right.
So thank you guys for also joining us this evening. Next week, Thursday, March 28th, we have Mike Tyree on the program, and we're going to be talking about surreal horror, which should be lots of fun. So stay tuned for that. And I hope you guys have a great evening.
Thanks, guys.